Hello and welcome to one of my pre-PTR Heroic Icecrown Citadel boss guides, where I've gone through and looked over old YouTube VODs, online forums, and Wowhead pages to try and produce a modern, up-to-date boss guide with as much relevant information as possible. I'll try to present each encounter in the most straightforward way that is applicable to everyone, then leave the discussion of boss mechanics, assignments, and logic for later in the video. Now before we get started, if you'd like to see more WoW content or want to help my channel grow, consider dropping a like, subscribing, and sharing this video with a friend. It really helps me out, and I appreciate the support. Otherwise, thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Rotface is a single phase encounter. You will need 2 tanks, 4 to 6 healers, and the rest DPS. This fight is a slow burn with a softened rage. The boss itself doesn't hit very hard and has fairly simple mechanics to contend with. The main challenge for this encounter is the ability to correctly manage and kite the adds when they spawn. But first, let's cover the boss's mechanics. Rotface himself only has 3 abilities. The first ability is Ooze Flood. Rotface will flood a quadrant of the room with ooze, and any player standing in it will take nature damage and have their movement slowed. On Heroic, players will gain a stacking debuff while standing in the ooze. Each stack decreases their movement speed by 10%. The section of the room this ability will target is telegraphed by ooze flowing out of pipes. Players simply need to move out of the targeted section. Next, Rotface will use Slime Spray. This is a channeled ability that deals nature damage per second in a frontal cone. This ability can be avoided by moving out of the frontal cone, but some raid teams will choose to have players soak this damage. We'll discuss this in more detail later. Lastly, Rotface will use Mutated Infection on a random player. This ability deals shadow damage per second and reduces healing done by 50% or 75% on Heroic. After 12 seconds, or when this ability is decursed, a small ooze is created at the target's location. Correctly navigating this ability is the main mechanic for this fight. The time between mutated infections steadily decreases the longer the fight goes on, meaning this mechanic acts as a softened rage. So either the boss dies, or the raid will eventually be overrun by adds. Speaking of adds, they possess the following abilities. Small oozes spawn with 500,000 threat on the target of mutated infection, and are not tauntable. They also use Sticky Ooze, spawning a green puddle that deals nature damage and slows players inside of it. Additionally, they possess the aura Weak Radiating Ooze, that damages players within 10 yards of it every 2 seconds. This aura will also cause the small ooze to merge with other nearby ooze. If 2 small oozes merge, a big ooze will spawn. Big oozes are tauntable and need to be kited by a tank. Big oozes will also use Sticky Ooze, possess a more lethal damaging aura, and gain a stacking damage buff that is applied each time an ooze merges with a big ooze. At 5 stacks of Unstable Ooze, it will use Unstable Ooze Explosion. This ability deals AoE damage to players within 6 yards of it, and additionally rains down small globules of slime at random players. These globules have travel time, and will target the location of players the moment the ability goes off. Thus, with good movement, players can avoid being hit. Raiders should pay attention to when this ability is used, and move out of their previous location the moment the explosion goes off. Note that players closer to the location of the big ooze will have less time to react. After exploding, players targeted by mutated infection will spawn small oozes that will once more combine to form a big ooze, and the cycle repeats. Finally, and on Heroic mode only, Professor Putricide will occasionally cast Vile Gas on random range players. This ability is identical to the Vile Gas mechanic on Festergut, affecting anyone within 7 yards of the target and leaving a dot that also disorients them for 6 seconds. In 25-man, Vile Gas will never target players in melee as long as there are at least 8 players in range. Speaking of ranged, let's discuss positioning. There are 2 common methods for handling this fight, depending on whether it's done on normal or heroic. On normal mode, tank the boss in the center of the room with all ranged and healers in a tight circle surrounding the boss. If ranged are positioned close enough to the boss, they won't need to move for Ooze Flood. This greatly trivializes the mechanic. Then, when Rotface targets a random player and begins casting Slime Spray, by positioning all ranged near the boss, they can quickly move out of the spray, avoiding this damage entirely. On Heroic mode, tank the boss in the center of the room with all ranged and healers spread 8 to 10 yards apart from each other around the entire room. Because of the heroic mechanic Vile Gas, players can no longer collapse on the boss like in normal. This means ranged players will need to run out of sections of the room flooded by ooze. Try to avoid stacking on other ranged players when avoiding this ability. Ranged players that have their section of the room flooded may want to consider running into melee range to avoid chaining multiple ranged players with vile gas. If this is done, just be sure your raid has enough players in range such that melee aren't being targeted by vile gas. Additionally, with this strategy, when players are targeted by slime spray, melee can avoid it, but ranged generally don't want to run out of the frontal cone. Unless you can move out of the frontal without running over another ranged player, it's better to eat this damage than it is to chain vile gas on multiple raid members. Pop a defensive and try to live through the damage. Now we can move on to arguably the most important rule for this encounter, hiding the adds. To understand how the adds work, we need to do some ooze math. If two small oozes come within range of each other, they will form a big ooze of size 1. If a small and a big ooze of size 1 come together, they will form a big ooze of size 2. If two big oozes come together, they will form a big ooze of one size larger than the smaller of the two initial ones. If a big ooze reaches size 5, it explodes. In both normal and heroic mode, your second tank will need to kite the big ooze in a circle around the perimeter of the room. On normal mode, your tank can cheat closer to the middle if your raid is stacked nearer to the boss. The important thing is to keep the big ooze as far away from raiders as possible due to its pulsing damage aura and the slime pools it drops. At the start of the fight, there will be no oozes. This means the first player targeted by mutated infection will need to run out of the raid and wait for a second ooze to spawn. Ideally, this player stands away from the raid to limit the number of players affected by the ooze's abilities. The small ooze cannot be taunted, and spawns in with 500,000 threat on the player that formerly had the mutated infection debuff. In other words, if targeted, you will have threat on the small ooze indefinitely until it's merged with another ooze. Once two small oozes have spawned and are brought together at the edge of the room, have your second tank ready to immediately taunt and establish threat on the resulting big ooze. While small oozes can't be taunted, big oozes can, and possess a normal aggro table. Big oozes hit hard, but move slowly, meaning they can be kited. Thus, players kiting the oozes should utilize ranged abilities to generate threat and avoid being hit. Death Knights are great for this role because of Icy Touch's 20-yard range. Your cutting tank will move in a circle with the big ooze around the edge of the room. Players fixated by mutated infection will run to the kiting tank, where they will either be decursed, or upon the debuff's expiration, they will drop their small ooze and have it absorbed by the big ooze before running back. At 5 stacks, the big ooze will explode, and the process repeats. During this time, the only mechanic the cutting tank needs to pay attention to is ooze flood. When Rotface floods a section of the room with ooze, the cutting player will need to quickly move through the slime. On heroic, this results in a stacking movement reduction debuff. This is another reason why Death Knights are great tanks for this role, because anti-magic shell lets them avoid being slowed for a period of time, and resets their stacks. If you don't have a DK tank, a Paladin's Hand of Freedom will also allow your cutting tank to traverse the slime without being slowed. Otherwise, your cutting tank will predictably move the big ooze in a circle around the room, enabling mutated infection targets to drop their slimes nearby to be absorbed. That said, players with threat on a small ooze should be careful not to come too close to the big ooze because of its pulsing damage aura. Small oozes are susceptible to slows, so using them can enable players to position their ooze in such a way that it can be absorbed without the target of the small ooze needing to run through the big ooze. Lastly, later in the fight, when Rotface applies mutated infection more frequently, it becomes more likely to have two players accidentally bring their small oozes together while a big ooze is already up. If this happens, the kiting tank needs to be ready to taunt and establish threat on the additional big ooze. Once brought together, the two big oozes will merge, and the kiting tank then returns to their usual pathing and rotation. And that's it. If you can successfully manage the ooze, this boss will eventually go down. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more ICC guides coming soon. See ya.